Hello, my name is Andrea Johnson, and I am the Minister of Congregational Programs at Minnesota Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. This month, our theme is deep listening, and today I'd like to talk about the importance of listening to voices of color, especially about the violence of the recent protests surrounding the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. It is striking how conversations about racial justice protests quickly move from the pain and moral demands that sit at the center to the violence that sometimes lives at the edges of them. Deep listening helps us notice how certain narratives and frames about the violence actually work to remove the protest's moral demands and pain from the center of the discussion, and how they distract and in many cases seek to undermine that work for justice. And these frames don't just live out there, they live inside many of us as well. As I listen to Black voices, here are some of the things I'm learning. The protests are primarily about police brutality, specifically the way that Black people are disproportionately victimized by law enforcement. They're also about institutional racism in education and healthcare. They're about police brutality, mass incarceration, and the income gap. The fact that COVID-19 is killing Black Americans at a higher rate than any other group. The protests are about the injustices, fear, and violence that Black Americans and other people of color face on a daily basis. And they're not just about the last few months or about recent decades, but instead about the centuries-long oppression and the equally long fight against it. Some people have asked me, is discrimination in policing really a problem? Isn't this just a case of a few bad apples that we need to get rid of? No. Beyond Floyd, Arbery, and Taylor, there is a greater pattern of police violence within this country. Research shows unequivocally that Black individuals are more likely to die at the hands of law enforcement than their white counterparts, and are also more likely to be stopped, searched, given citations, and arrested by police, even while exhibiting similar behavior to their white counterparts. The history of American law enforcement is also rooted in maintaining white supremacy, going far back as the early slave patrols of the 1700s, and eventually evolving into municipal police departments that would go on to enforce racist Jim Crow laws. While a lot of our laws have since modernized, echoes of this history are still felt today. I've also heard some in our congregation ask about the looting and violence during the protests, and doesn't this do more harm than good? At the heart of these protests is the loss of life, most recently George Floyd, but also informed by the countless other Black lives lost to police violence each year. These unjust deaths and seeming disregard for human lives will rightfully surface a lot of feelings: anger, sadness, frustration, unrest. Disruptive behavior like looting, vandalism, and violence are the byproduct of years and years and years of injustice and inaction. Historically, they're also some of the most effective tactics for driving attention to the injustice and inaction because they're disruptive. The Stonewall Uprisings was a series of riots that catalyzed the LGBTQ rights movement. Or the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed in response to the riots following Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Also, let's acknowledge that not all protesters are employing these tactics. The majority of people are demonstrating peacefully and encouraging others to do the same. There also may be evidence of people from the outside of these communities acting in bad faith to incite violence. The bottom line is that these protests are a response to long-held pain. There is a history of violence against Black people in a lot of the communities currently erupting in protest. Baltimore saw this kind of grief following the death of Freddie Gray, who sustained a fatal spinal cord injury while in police custody in 2016. Cleveland is still reeling from the killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, shot by a police officer while playing with a toy pellet gun. And here in Minnesota, we are no stranger to police violence. In 2017, we saw the killing of Philando Castile, who was shot in front of his girlfriend and daughter while reaching for his wallet during a traffic stop. What's happening is an expression of frustration and a reaction to trauma built up over lifetimes of injustice. And it's only being compounded by law enforcement's increased use of force against those protesting it. I'd like to end my talk with a few tools we can use to deepen our authentic and systematic engagement towards social change. The path is complex and often messy as we begin unraveling privilege from our lives. But don't run away. This is what we're trained to do. Stay engaged. Untrain yourself. We must read, talk, critically reflect on issues, stories, and examples of how injustice and privilege show up in our lives. We need to support and encourage one another. We need to acknowledge the fear and isolation that comes from refusing privilege and shifting an oppressive system. Our support and encouragement is the salve for the hurt that comes from a system trying to keep us in line. We need to celebrate the discomfort that often occurs while we're learning and growing. It is inherently uncomfortable at times, but stick with it. We also need to connect to community. Here at MVUUF and other places, we cannot do this work alone, and people at all stages of development need collaborators and supporters. And finally, take risks. Actions that interrupt oppression and injustice are often messy and rarely neatly resolved. We need to take the risk to interrupt the cycle even when we are indelicate, inarticulate, or messy ourselves. Let's find the courage to do what is needed when it is needed. Let's make it so.